Okay, right, I'll try and be brief about this. This paper really began life, there's some work with a group at the University of Warwick and the Bodies of Value project. And they asked me to think about the earlier work I'd done on the reproductive bargain in terms of the current political economic context. But I'm glad that previous papers, Penny particularly has emphasized the importance of work by older people, older women. And I have to say, since I'm older, I don't have any animations, I don't have any videos, and I don't even have any photographs. So you'll have to do with just words. And the other thing I just want to say is that, I just want to put out there, as they say, that care is a very problematic term. There's all kinds of care. There's what I call cuddly care. There's creative care, there's dirty care, there's all kinds of aspects of care, and I think it might have been an error for feminists to adopt this word care, which has all kinds of connotations. And really, and it was particularly interesting in your last remark that you could separate care work from going to fetch water and so on. And in my view, that's all reproductive work. And I think it's really problematic to focus on interpersonal, cuddly or callous care or whatever it is. The issue, I think, is wider than that. And really what I wanted to do was think about what kind of analytical frameworks we have and we have used in order to think about this issue. And what are the current political challenges for doing anything about it? So, okay, here I go. Now, I started off with what is probably familiar to many of you, which is Sharazawa's care diamond, which is a very useful schematic representation of where the sources of care and reproductive work. And she suggests that there are these four corners of the diamond: the state at various levels, families and households, markets, and the not-for-profits, community, voluntary sector. Now, all this is true, but my problem with this that these are the sources rather than the resources, and there's a danger of being sucked into these schematic kind of divisions. So I went back to some earlier work that, right, I'm not back to that yet, okay. So these are the four sources of care. And I think it's problematic in various ways because the state is unproblematized and it's static and it's bounded. And it doesn't look at transnational movements of labour, care and other kinds of labour. And it's also, I think, still in this linear model of development of moving towards states that has the capacity and, with political struggle, the willingness to provide collective reproductive services, when the current moment in global accumulation suggests otherwise, though of course there are lots of variation. And it also assumes the possibility or the actuality of a civil society that is in a position to facilitate the provision of such services. So I did then go back to my early work, which I had done about 20 years ago now. Was it 20 years ago? Anyway, to talk about the reproductive bargain, which I think offers a more dynamic way of thinking about this issue. Because actually what is provided by the state or any other source of resources and services is the result of a political struggle. I defined the reproductive bargain. Shireen Rai was very keen, I defined it. So here is my definition. Refers to the implicit contract between the state and the citizenry about the provisions of resources and services for reproduction of people through their life course. And I think it is the provisioning rather than the source which is important. And I think this relates to another discussion which we won't have now about what we mean by social reproduction. I noticed Penny used that term quite a lot. And I think social reproduction is quite problematic because people use it in different ways. And I think, does it just mean socialized reproduction? Or does it mean something else? Or does it mean any kind of generational reproduction? And I think one needs to think about that anyway. So this work was first developed when I did some work on Cuba in the 1990s. Where there was a very, very rapid transition from a situation where the state really did resource daily and generational reproduction to a very large extent, and the wage did not need to, wage was very low and didn't need to cover all these things at all. You know, children of workers got fed in the schools or workplaces. Pre-university teenagers from the age of 14 went to boarding school, and all their reproductive costs were met by the state. All utilities were subsidized, housing was totally subsidized, transport was subsidized. So the wage did not need to meet the reproductive needs of the economy. Now, we said a lot in earlier decades about the effects of structural adjustment on diminishing the power of the ability of states to resource reproductive services. And sometimes that earlier stuff, if you reread it, that we did in the 80s, reads as though there were all these fully functional welfare states all over the world, and suddenly along came structural adjustment and abolished it. And of course the reality was quite different. However, in Cuba, that was the reality. You could see it happening under your feet. So it was really interesting to see how this struggle about reproduction was fought politically. And I think it helps us think of why we need to be concerned about unpaid work. And it's not just about equality between men and women, it goes much deeper than that. And we need to be concerned with what Kate Young called women's condition, rather than just women's position vis-a-vis men. And I think there's an enormous muddle in the discussion of gender and reproduction about this. Well, I think there is throughout gender and development. There's always a complete confusion about whether you're talking about the material condition of women or whether you're talking about their position vis-a-vis men. And I think we need to think more carefully about those. So I wanted to bring in some more recent work this discussion back to focusing on the state and the role of the state for provisioning and regulating care and reproductive services, and to think about not just care but the reproduction of labour power, which in my old-fashioned Marxist way I think is what social reproduction is about, but also to think about the extent to which this is really possible in a post-crisis global economy, because politically that's the question I think that confronts us. So to think about what kind of state there is to bargain with, and I think this moment when we're between post-war welfare states, which have politically and economically declined anyways, and the experience of the 2008 financial crisis and the political implications, some would say, the vindication or the re-establishment of the hegemony of neoliberal economics is a real challenge in thinking about what are we doing, say, well, of course women do this unpaid work, you know, recognize us. You know, we need to think about what that debate and that intervention is about. And, I was thinking about the whole Greek crisis and things. In all the political and economic discussion, they do talk about transfer payments, pensions, they talk about some reproductive services, health services, and education. There's nothing about domestic work, unpaid work, the way in which the reduction of public resources has an implication on inter-household gender relations and so on. It's not even on the political agenda, and the question I asked earlier about Piketty was precisely that: who cares? Who's interested? Who are we talking to when we are raising the issue of unpaid work? And I think the political discourse, because of the increasing power of of neoliberal and rather economically illiterate economic discourse, there's this discourse about we mustn't waste taxpayers' money, which is also translated into official development assistance. Where's it going? What's it doing? Who's it for? It's our money, it's our resources, and it shouldn't be spent on other people's reproductive services. And that is a real political challenge. In the UK and in other post-industrial societies where we are and burdened with an aging society, the demands on public services reflect that demographic change in as much as they respond to it. And so there is in Britain, and I'm sure there is elsewhere, this discourse about, how old, it's really interesting, old people are taking, an undue share of, they had their good times, we did. We had pre-university education, and we had increasing prosperities, and we've all done better than our parents, and so on and so forth. And now, we're living on these bloated pensions while younger people are struggling to, get into the housing market, and so on and so forth. As though, because we have this, they're alarmed about the dependency ratio of working to non-working people's population. They've raised the pension age and so on. But interestingly, in our government, let's see what the budget says on Wednesday, but the way the British government, Conservative government, is responding to it, there's no suggestion that pensions would be reduced. It's working people's benefits and in-work benefits and unemployed benefits that are going to be reduced, housing benefits and so on. So the aging of the population has this very, odd position. On the one hand, the younger people can blame it. On the other hand, politically, it's untouchable. And in a sense, you saw that reflected in Greece. This is a bit of a tangent, but it does reinforce the political challenges of then saying, let's recognize and remunerate properly unpaid work. And it is a political challenge. And also, the whole economic discourse is about the competitiveness of capital, rather than the things about care and reproduction that we talk about, well-being and so on. Well-being is not actually on the political economic agenda. So the policies which have responded to this in post-industrial economies have really had the effect of increasing inequality, not just in terms of earned income, but in terms of what the reproductive bargain that represents, i.e. in terms of what the wage has to cover rather than doesn't have to cover, because of the reduction in publicly provisioned services. And that is in terms of resources as well as direct supply. Developing countries, what I find really interesting is that much of the development discourse still continues as though the state is going to be the universal provider. And in my view, some of you will disagree with this, this is exacerbated by particularly Indian exceptionalism. India and South Africa are a particularly historical form of state which has a particular capacity, and so have developed a state structure for what it is, that has a capacity to do what it does. But lots of other states have never had that capacity. The problem for me is, I mean, Geeta doesn't seem to agree with me, and I'm sure she will tell us, but the problem for me is that these are often the examples that they use to stand for all developing states, and of course they don't. But there is this expectation that somehow the state is going to have the resources and political will to prioritize welfare and reproductive state expenditure. And in my view, experience doesn't tell us that. And so I think there's this drip of reducing expectations on the state, and at the same time, us feminists in gender development are saying, let's recognize unpaid work. And I think it's a really important question to say, why? Who are we talking to? What do we expect of this? And I think that you know, the argument about the international TTIP treaty is about whether international capital can have access to the reproductive services that were previously state supplied and make a profit from them, and that's certainly what we see here. And I think the other issue that I think is really important when we talk about various forms of care work and unpaid work and invisible work is the extent to which a lot of that precarious work depends on migrant labour. But the migrant labour, which are actively sought in lots of accumulating contexts, you know, Indonesian workers in Malaysian electronics factories, or in this region, East European migrant agricultural workers and so on, that the state actually has no responsibility for the reproduction of those workers, and that's why they're so cheap. And so there's always a political struggle, which is the basis of the UK's argument with the European Union. How can we access that cheap labour without paying for it? Now, if that's the political context, what is the argument about unpaid work and care work about? So really what I wanted to say is that this is a discursive and political struggle. It's not just about the challenge of appropriate policies and so on. And I don't think that we're going to make any progress in that struggle unless we are really real about what we expect, or what we understand to be the global context that we're talking about. And I think that, you know, when you've got a situation where you've got the policies of don't waste other people's money, that households and communities and states have to balance their budget, whether they have a single currency or not, where you've got a discourse that overseas development assistance is being wasted on the wrong things or being given to states who don't know how to spend it and so on. There is a real crisis in the whole development discourse, which isn't going to be fixed by not connecting the debates about unpaid work and the importance of care work for accumulation with the political economy analysis. So that's all I want to say now.